afternoon, everyone. Right, so Simon and I actually synchronized our talk so that he would give you a little bit about what systematic conservation planning is, but we discovered that we're talking on different days and different themes. So tomorrow, we're also talking about systematic conservation planning, and you might want to come and check out some of the gap analysis work that we're showing tomorrow as well. But that's by way of just saying that some of the stuff, I'm not going into detail on the technical work, we're just looking at the high-level stuff in 10 minutes. And I guess I should start with explaining that systematic approaches are a conservation planning approach that's based on setting quantitative conservation objectives and then planning for the persistence, the representation and persistence of biodiversity. And they were pioneered in the terrestrial and marine realm. And since the last World Parks Congress, there's been a lot of progress, substantial progress in freshwater ecosystems on systematic approaches. And some of the progress is highlighted in the slide here. We've had freshwater biodiversity surrogates being able to map both in terms of modeling species distributions as well as in terms of classifying ecosystems. If you can't put biodiversity on a map, you're not going to be able to plan for it. So that was the first thing that was a massive leap forward in being able to operationalize these approaches for freshwater domain. We then were able to develop river tree networks and associated subcatchments like the hydrosheds model that Simon's just spoken about, that Bernard Menner developed. River tree networks are quite interesting because they allow you to understand where a river reach is in relation to another river reach, which then enables you to start building a longitudinal connectivity. And once we were able to do that, we were able to start tackling how to put conservation planning algorithms, how to adapt those to cater for directional connectivity, so lateral connectivity as well as longitudinal connectivity. Virgilio's also looked at temporal connectivity, and we've got a little bit of a way to go with vertical connectivity in groundwater systems. Another advance was being able to take the 30 years, 3 decades of work that's been done in bioassessment on ecological integrity and look at how that could be used in conservation plans to build in planning for persistence. Now that's something that we could talk about with protected area gap analysis in our discussion. Building in ecological integrity, I think, would work. There are 2 strategies that I want to focus on today before I move to just showing you a bit of a case study that we've been doing for the decade in South Africa, is the hierarchical protection strategy and a whole body of work that was done in the terrestrial conservation planning arena of looking at how to move these good plans and knowledge into action. So the one slide, the hierarchical protection strategy that was developed, shows a conceptual model of moving from 2 different levels of protection. So the red areas are showing freshwater focal areas. The green areas, critical management zones, which are connected and should actually have a little bit of use restrictions to prevent any ecological degradation in the red areas. And then overall the catchment management zone. And why I think that was important was it got away from this argument of, oh, we need the whole catchment, because that really just wasn't helping us operationalize conservation areas for freshwater. So instead, we were able then to focus on multiple use zones within a catchment and key leverage points that needed to be conserved so that we didn't have to lock away the whole catchment. And so for me, this operationalized the way we could actually set up freshwater conservation areas. The other thing that I think is really profound in the last decade was being able to build on some of the lessons that were coming out in the terrestrial conservation planning world, was that our plans were sitting on shelves. And so it was about trying to move from planning to action and involving stakeholders early on in the process. And by involving them, I think what we do is we actually create tools and maps that actually can catalyze cooperation through the planning process themselves, to create dialogue, and then afterwards you have this map that's a single consistent source that everybody uses. So I think that's really important in the freshwater domain, particularly because if you're dealing with catchments and water as a high commodity, you're going to have very strong cooperation among many actors and stakeholders. So I'm just going to take you now through a few slides, a decade of work that we've been doing in South Africa on freshwater conservation planning and trying to promote shared conservation action and collaboration through conservation planning maps and through the process. Our journey started in 2005 when we were able to take the seed of how we were going to do systematic conservation planning forward into a national arena. And we got together key national departments of departments that manage water, so the Environment Affairs and Water Affairs, who particularly didn't talk to each other and kept throwing freshwater ecosystems backwards and forwards. Environment Affairs thought water was Water Affairs' problem, and Water Affairs thought biodiversity was environment's problem. So freshwater ecosystems were going nowhere in terms of their conservation. So we got those two key departments, as well as the Department of Agriculture, Housing, Minerals and Energy together, to come through a series of iterative meetings and come up with some conservation vision that they could share and link these to shared policy objectives, which set the scene for conservation planning, because those policy objectives there set quantitative conservation objectives, plan for representation, plan for persistence, enable effective conservation and implementation and monitoring of conservation outcomes. These are systematic conservation planning principles. So they set the scene for systematic conservation planning. And from this process came about several key agencies getting together to take the first step to try and identify these shared conservation areas. So we set up a project which was a 4-year project looking at identifying freshwater ecosystem priority areas, or FEPAs, terrible acronym, and then to pair that very explicitly with a social process that would enable, would develop this institutional basis to enable effective implementation. And we went back to our goals that we'd done in the cross-sector policy process, which was now 2 years earlier, and we turned them into quantitative objectives to put into Marxan. So planning for representation, we said in the cross-sector policy process, we got people to agree that 20% of the length of every river ecosystem type in South Africa was a good representation target to aspire to. We looked at threatened fish species as well as actually wetland-dependent bird species using IUCN threatened species thresholds. We also planned for persistence by building in connectivity, not just in the way we selected the areas, but also in terms of allowing for fish migration corridors and wetland clusters, which is swapping metapopulation dynamics, so they're clusters of wetlands embedded in natural landscapes. And then, of course, we ran protected areas wherever possible. And then we went through an entire process that took 2 years of collecting data at a regional level, digging people out of their rivers, getting them to workshops, getting their databases, and then actually reviewing the input data before we even ran Marxan. So it took us 2 years to collate this data, and there's a powerful message in it because it's collectively it's 1,000 person years of experience that went into collating this data, and it's a huge national resource now for environmental practitioners to use. We ran it through Marxan and we got a map on the, there we go, that's the map that Marxan sort of gives. And from there, what we did is we tried to interpret that map with stakeholders so that they could use it in their day-to-day life and their policy processes in a way that would actually promote conservation through their policy tools. So we used the hierarchical protection strategy here, where we looked at our freshwater focal areas and the things that needed quite strong use restrictions, things that needed to be watched but you could use but with sensitivity, and then the catchment management zones, the upstream management areas we called them. And a lot of debate went into the names and the colours and everything like that. Was actually quite tedious. But we managed to get agreement with everybody there. And then not just colouring things in on a map, but actually linking them to specific ecosystem management guidelines is really important. And we were able to do that and also show how these maps could be used in over 30 different policy processes. And we put that all together in an implementation manual, which went together with the maps. And so we ended up with a FEPA map. For every catchment in South Africa, there's 19 catchments, which really tell you which rivers and wetlands and estuaries should remain healthy, and that means in an A or B state in South Africa, in a good or natural condition. And really what this gave us was a nationally consistent information source in which you could drill down if you wanted more further detail. That was also supplied. We also sought political endorsement and media coverage, and this was quite important because the ministers of all the departments and respective departments had to buy into this so that people could use it in their daily life. We did widespread dissemination and training and provided this freely, the data freely to environmental practitioners. And this free dissemination, I think, resulted in a huge diversity of uses. So it's been used in the protection area expansion strategy, so not just terrestrial systems get included. It's been used in the Water Act, the Biodiversity Act, and then also at smaller levels, at catchment scales and at the EIA level. So I think in conclusion, what I wanted to say was that systematic conservation planning principles and tools, if we were at the last World Parks Congress, there was still a lot of debate as to whether they were applicable in freshwater settings. And indeed, I think the application and the research and development that's gone on in the last decade has shown that they are. And I think they provide a very scientifically credible way of identifying these conservation areas. But if they're coupled with a process that involves diversity of users in a legitimate and relevant way, they can really greatly help forge cooperation amongst different sectors that are acting in catchments and managing catchments. And that really, it just relates to the credibility, relevance, and legitimacy of the product, which are really the three principles for moving knowledge to action.